Hello everyone. Today we are going to cover two different types of bears. The Professor Bear, who I haven't mentioned before, although I have told you a little bit about Professor Darwin here, and also rabbits who are bears, of which this is one, possibly the only one I know about at the moment. But who knows? More rabbits who are bears may yet come forward after this. But yes, this is Rabbit, and he works with Professor Darwin. They live together. Rabbit started off by being Professor Darwin's assistant, in actual fact, because he's a very helping sort of rabbit. Look at that face. Wants to be helpful, multi-talented. And Professor Darwin, as it happened, was just looking for somebody to help him out with his work. So they ended up writing a book about all the different types of bears. So, which is called, funnily enough, Are Rabbits Bears? Because Rabbit insists he's a rabbit who is a bear, and Darwin insists that's impossible. No, you're not a bear. I will write an encyclopedia of the different types of bears, and then I'll be able to explain to everyone about the bears and about how rabbits are not bears, which is not actually how it turns out. But you'll need to read the book to find that out. But two different types of bears that you might have in your own home. You might have a rabbit who is a bear. It might be a rabbit, or it might be something else who is a bear. It might be octopus who is a bear, or a dog who is a bear. We don't know, do we? But let me tell you a little bit about how to recognize these unusual bears. So, got your companion guide to Are Rabbits Bears, which has got all the different types, 12 of the different types of bears that you will encounter, the most common types. Part 2 will give you another 12, and part 3 another 12. So there'll be about 40 altogether. But so we have rabbits who are bears. There you go. Again, they're very special. But let's go through a few of the obvious traits to see whether you can spot whether you've got one at home. So, rabbits who are bears are optimists. There is a kind of bear called an optobear, who I am going to go over in another video. But rabbits who are bears are quite similar, actually, in that they always believe the best of everything and everyone. Therefore, they hardly ever take offence. Although it does happen, referring you back to the book again, it happens a few times. So they're rather like optobears in that respect. They're also curious about everything. Look at that little face. Does he look curious to you? Yeah, it's like she's curious about everything. She isn't a rabbit who is a bear. She's a different type of bear. Coming up in a future book. But curious about everything, always asking questions. So these two, that's why you have to be discerning, so get your notebook, write down the traits, and then decide whether all of them actually fit your bear, or whether perhaps you've got a rabbit who is a bear rather than an optobear. So they love to plan and make lists and lists of lists. That's another trait of rabbits who are bears. Cheerful and happy-go-lucky, always looking forward rather than back, and very good at thinking up ideas. Also good at tinkering with things to make them work. So, some technical skills, this rabbit who is a bear. And you'll get appearance, likes and dislikes. So, for example, under likes, music, especially jazz. They have even been described as having jazz ears. This expression comes from the idea of how they would look in a piano bar, their paws flying over the keyboard and their ears dancing to the music. And you know, don't you, that I'm just going to have to demonstrate that for you. Rabbit does have one or two favourite pop songs, actually. There is one by Robbie Williams called The Road to Mandalay. It's his absolute favourite. And he does the whole thing with the Penelope. Hang on. She get knocked out. The whole thing with, yeah. Do you see what I mean when I say jazz ears? Very expressive ears. He just absolutely loves to bounce about. So, expressive ears. He does have very expressive ears, and you will find in the book it often talks about him having ears to attention, which obviously in this rabbit he mostly has ears down here. But that's not his fault, it's because they're floppy. But obviously in the bear dimension, he has full control of the ears, and sometimes they can be standing to attention or circling like helicopter blades on the very rare occasions that he might get a little bit upset or angry, which again can happen, but it's coming up in a future book. So, dislikes. An Optobear rabbit who, an Optobear, he is quite Optobear. An Optobear rabbit, really, who, he loves everyone, he's happy-go-lucky. So, what might he dislike? Well, being alone for long periods. These are very sociable bears, and they like to be around others. They don't like the cold. They will endure it patiently, but if there is somewhere warmer to be, then they would rather be there. I feel like rabbit does take after me quite a bit, actually. Oh, not having a job to do. They like to feel needed. So that's why rabbit ends up, I think, being Darwin's assistant, because he is looking for a new role in life at that point. So it's quite important, I think, for all bears, really, I think all humans as well, to have some kind of role and some kind of purpose. But I think for this particular type of rabbits who are bears, having a role, being needed, is actually really important, isn't it, Rabbit? Thank you very much for your demonstrations of your jazz ears, because that was excellent. So now that we've seen Rabbit, we're going to have to cover Professor Bears. You sit there, Rabbit. Now, Professor Bears, as I've said before, I do have a Professor Bear. Professor Darwin is part of the household, but he looks slightly different from his picture, the actual bear, because the illustrator is incredible at getting the essence of something and putting it on to paper. But that sometimes means that the result is a little bit different from how you would expect, but still brilliant. It still has that whole, this bear, that is how I see Darwin. That is how I see Professor Darwin in the bear dimension. The bear that I have, Professor Darwin, with his little glasses and his little cricket jumper and everything. In the bear dimension, that is how he would look. Because bears can have more than one form. So, get your thinking heads on here. Because let's take a bear. Who should we take? For example, yes, Penelope. So here she is in a little Norfolk Broads t-shirt with her mad fur. Isn't she wonderful? When she goes back to the bear dimension, she's Animar. So when at the end of a bear's life, the Animar, it comes out of the bear, we leave this bit behind, this sort of furry, this stuffed bit, and the Animar goes back to the bear dimension, and it takes whatever shape it wants, really. But with bears, what will happen is, say after their first life, say this was Penelope's first life, then she'd go back to the bear dimension, and she didn't really know any other form at that point. So she would choose to appear to the other bears in this form, most likely. However, say for some reason she'd seen a pink bear or a blue bear or something in a magazine and was desperate to look like that, then she could alter her form in the bear dimension so that she looked like that. And now you're thinking, how do bears recognize each other? But that is a subject for another video. But it is something that bears can do when they're in the bear dimension and when they're not carting around the little stuffed bodies, which obviously they can do. But at the end of a life, obviously the Animar, it comes out of the bear and heads for the bear dimension, and then it can take any shape it likes. So, coming back to Professor Bears, let's give you a quick, there you go, Professor Bears. So you have to imagine this little bear here. Can you see him? Yeah, that's him. He's usually looking a little bit critical because the thing with Professor Bears is generally they have a high opinion. They have a high opinion of themselves, perhaps for a good reason. They've studied and they've learned a lot of things, and we should all have good opinions of ourselves. But Professor Bears are really very good at doing it, and sometimes it's a slightly higher opinion of themselves than they really should have. But that's just a Professor Bear for you. So obviously they love books. They love learning things, studying, and they also love to let other bears know that they know a lot of things and they studied a lot of things, particularly Rabbit. So Darwin and Rabbit, they get on ever so well because Rabbit is he's very happy-go-lucky. He doesn't mind that Darwin knows more than him. Even when Darwin gets a bit of, I know more than you do, Rabbit. Rabbit's just like, oh yes, Professor, that's fine. He doesn't mind. There's one or two areas where he may take a stand. And one of those, of course, is you're not a bear. Important. So let's look at Professor Bears and see about their personality. So this is how you can recognise whether you've got a Professor Bear at home. Often found with their head in a book. So easy peasy, get a book, any book, and wave it at the bear you think might be a Professor Bear. Now, if their eyes light up, there's a good chance because Professor Bears love books. Any book, any book. So then, of course, they might, what's the book about? If they find it something terribly simple or perhaps a comic, we don't really approve of graphic novels, really. They don't realise the love and care that goes into them and how great they can be. They'd probably be a little bit sniffy about those, I think. Perhaps a picture book. Oh dear. Yeah. Bit beneath them. But otherwise, if it's something they could learn about, then you'll probably find that they're very interested. And when you leave the room, they'll be back in that book and trying to learn about everything new because they are very interested, like rabbits. They are very interested in things, but perhaps from a rather more serious point of view. So here we go. Personality may not appreciate silliness and laughter. Oh dear, Rabbit. Amazing these two get on, but they do. They can enjoy a joke, but it would probably need to be an intellectual joke that only someone as smart as them could understand. Yes, it can be a little bit like that, but you've got to love them. They are actually very lovable. So they can be a little bit hard to talk to if they are thinking important thoughts. So, for example, you've got a bear, you're thinking, are they still, is the animal still in there? They're looking off into space. Well, it might be a Professor Bear who's thinking important thoughts. Now, the best way to deal with this is to speak to them in complicated language. Long words are their favourite thing, so best to learn some if you want their attention. In fact, on the website, All Things Bear Dimension, you'll find a little download with long words to use with Professor Bears and word games because they love nothing more than a word game. They really do enjoy wordplay of all kinds, in common with another type of bear, actually, but we'll come back to them. So, appearance. Often wearing spectacles, like my bear. Even if they aren't short-sighted, they like to look studious. So, it's nothing to do with actually what they can see. It may, in fact, be that they want to look a little bit studious. Fair enough. Possibly wearing some sort of ribbon, badge, or medal that shows everyone how clever and important they are. Are you starting to get the idea of what these bears are like? They're great. They are great. Might be wearing a waistcoat. That's quite a professorial thing to be wearing, actually, a waistcoat. May seem slightly deaf. This is usually because they're thinking very hard. Try waving a dictionary or important-looking book at them. That should get their attention. That is a very good way to jolt a Professor Bear out of his thinking very hard moments, because he'll see a dictionary, especially if it doesn't work at first, get something big and heavy, some big thick book. And the bigger the book, thicker the book, they will assume it's more important. It might not be, but they'll probably assume that. So, likes and dislikes. He likes to take a little snooze mid-afternoon. but they don't like others to know this. So if they nod off, pretend you haven't noticed. You do have to be a little bit careful with Professor Bear's egos because they do like to think that they are very important. This is, I think, why Rabbit and Darwin get on so well, because Rabbit's just he's actually a very intelligent rabbit. And he knows when perhaps Darwin needs to be humored slightly rather than saying, oh, have you nodded off in your chair again? He doesn't do that. And they get on excellently for it. So, dislikes, silly clothes. So watch out for that one. They think Professor Bears should always wear sensible outfits. So don't make them a sparkly Christmas hat because they won't appreciate it. A paper one will do. I don't really like parties at all, but might be prepared to enter into the spirit of things if you can convince them it's educational. Or like a big festival, such as Christmas or other big religious festival. I think they would probably see it as their duty to join in with something that's culturally important. That's how you might call it Christmas, you might call it Diwali, whatever. They'll call it culturally important and perhaps I should attend. And then they would probably consent to wearing a paper hat. But every bear's different, so you just have to get to know them. And if they look really upset, then you'll either have to come up with a really good argument why they should wear a hat or let them off. Anyway, I hope that's given you a little bit more insight into the Professor Bear. And they don't always have to be small and round. They could be very big. And that's why you always have to look beneath the surface. Isn't that right, Rabbit? So another couple of types of bears for you to think about, the Professor Bear and the rabbits who are bears. But next time I'm going to cover the Octobear. So he's been waiting for his turn. This is Percival Dumplington Smythe, and he's an Octobear. So we're going to cover those next time, along with something called a small helping bear. So until next time.